Hello, Grace, and welcome back to Cover to Cover. Today is April 17, and today we're covering 1 Samuel chapter 23 all the way to chapter 25. We're also hitting Psalm 54. We are continuing in David's wilderness wanderings, which may be narratively intended to parallel Israel's own wanderings in the wilderness. It's a time in desolation where he learns to grow and be with God. And that's exactly what we see in today's lesson. Quick rundown, 1 Samuel 23, David is hiding in the wilderness and his location is alerted by the Ziphites. Saul comes to go find him and it looks like David's going to be captured. However, that is not to be. Psalm 54 is written at about this time, or is referenced to this time in its superscription, and this is where David talks about that act of being betrayed. Next, 1 Samuel 24, Saul goes to relieve himself in a cave, and David is there, and David spares Saul's life. Next, we learn that Samuel dies, and that has its own implications. And then following that, we have this really interesting scenario where David encounters somebody named Nabal. He is slighted by Nabal, and he vows vengeance, but Nabal's wife, Abigail, comes and intervenes. Finally, our reading today ends with David marrying Abigail. And, what's going on there? David has a second wife from Jezreel. And we also learned that David's wife, Michal, who was given to him by Saul, Saul's daughter, has been given to another man. And so that's how today's readings conclude. In yesterday's section, we saw David gain access to the priesthood and the ephod when Abiathar joined him. Today, what we're going to see is that David is acting more and more like a king. He's making covenants, he's building alliances, he's building a constituency, and he's also exercising restraint. And that's a key element here. In the first section, David is there hiding in the wilderness, and the narration just kind of tells us that his group of men has increased from 400 to 600. So people are just flocking to David. It's starting to grow just organically. In this first section, we also see Jonathan and David meet. And this is the last time we're going to see Jonathan and David together in the narrative. And Jonathan says something really touching. He says, "You will be king, and I will be beside you, as my father knows." The dialogue that we see in Samuel is significant. If there's one thing I really want to point out here, is it is unusual in ancient Near Eastern literature to spend this much time in character dialogue and in not so much the dialogue, but the interiority of the characters, learning about them through their own words. So if there's a few things that I want to really point out in this entire narrative throughout the book of Samuel, is pay attention to the dialogue and the things that people say. Anyhow, back to our plot line. The Ziphites are the people of the region, don't seem to be upset or too happy with having a marauding band of 600 people roaming the areas. They let Saul know what's going on, and he comes and he looks like he's going to capture David. But he doesn't. Saul gets pulled away by the Philistines. He has to respond to a raid, and that's when David writes Psalm 54. Which brings me to the second thing I'd like to note about this whole passage is Psalm 54 is superscripted to note the betrayal by the Ziphites. But note that in the early verses, there's a crisis that's present, but by the time we get to the end, David describes God's deliverance as if it's already happened. Through it all, there's thanksgiving and voluntary offerings, and even before the outcome is known, David is there just engaging in acts of praise. Apart from the superscription, the Psalms are written in non-specific language and written in liturgical language that kind of allow us to insert our own lives and our own struggles into these prayers. Rather than going through the whole rest of everything, we'll wrap it up and we'll say probably a couple of really significant things. One very significant thing I'd like you to notice is when Saul goes in to relieve himself in the cave, David happens to be already there, and David cuts a corner of the hem of Saul's robe. The robe theme throughout the book of Samuel is what we call a leitmotif. Whenever you see the robe, it carries with it a certain kind of meaning and intention, and that intention is built upon. We first see it in Jonathan's meeting with David, where Jonathan gives his robe to David. And so we have this idea of the kingship that's going to go there voluntarily. Then we see Saul tearing Samuel's robe. And so we see this involuntary relinquishing of it. And Samuel actually says, just as you tore my robe, the kingdom will be torn from you. Then we see the example that we noted previously where Saul prophesies naked. He lays down his robe. And then finally right here we see David cutting off a corner of the robe. And so learning these little things are going to really add to your Bible study and enrich your study quite a bit. With that said, enjoy your reading.